Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this essay that I gave you by Edgar Allan Poe called The Philosophy of Composition. And that, because you've read it already, right? Talks about the way that he composed the poem The Raven. And that's not in your book, but you've probably read it before or heard it. And I've also given you a link, I think, or a PDF so that you can find it. And I wish we could have an in-class discussion because I'm really curious to find out what you all think, and I think that's one of the discussion questions that I put up for this week. Because I have sort of contrasting feelings about this. In some ways, I think a piece like this is important because it talks about the importance of form, and I'm hitting this idea of form over the head over and over again. But a poem is not just about like the meaning. The poem is a made thing, right? It is an object. It's an art object, and so the shape of that object is important. And a lot of times, I've been educated as a literature student, but also as a writer. And the more I do writing, the more I write, the more I understand that a lot of this is intuitive and that you have to focus on the form. And by focusing on the form, the content just sort of comes out automatically. And so I think it's good to have an essay like this where he talks about the importance of form, but then sometimes I just don't believe a single word that he says. If we look on page 276, this is the second or third page, the second page of actual text here. The work proceeded step by step to its completion with the precise and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. So I don't for a second believe that. I mean, maybe Edgar Allan Poe wrote everything with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. But in my experience, writing doesn't function that way. In any sort of criticism that I've read or art theory or anything like that, form is important, but the process is not mathematical. But I do think it's interesting to think about the things that he thought were important. And so what were those? And he's thinking about how he wants to elicit emotion, and he talks about how he can accomplish that through incident, which is sort of the setting and the predicament of the poem, because The Raven does have a narrative. It's another narrative poem, right? There's a story being told there. And so the situation of Lenore being lost and the speaker sitting in his room and the creepy raven coming and just speaking that one word to him. So that's the incident, but also through tone. And how he tries to accomplish that through tone is through sound in the poem, right? And a lot of times we think just about the meaning of the poem. What is this poem supposed to mean? But a poem should be enjoyed, or at least experienced. Sometimes we don't always enjoy poetry. But you need to be conscious of the experience of the poem, which includes all of these formal aspects of it. Because if I go back to the tiger, which I've talked about already, I experienced that poem primarily through the sound, right? It's not like, I don't think first of the meaning of that poem. I think first of the sound and how the sound propels me throughout the poem. And that functions in a different way than Out, where I'm more focused on the incident than on the tone. And in the first poem, I think the tone is the more important thing than the incident. And in Out, I think the incident is more important than the tone, although there are tonal qualities there. And so I think it's interesting to think about how Poe claims to have chosen the O sound and the R sound, right? Because they're sonorous and easily producible. And that's on page 728. The long O is the most sonorous vowel in connection with R is the most producible consonant. And so a word that uses both of those sounds is nevermore. And then he chooses, well, what should happen in the poem? So he chooses the raven because it is, quote, the bird of ill omen. And I just find this really interesting, and like I said, I have a very complicated relationship with this essay. I think it's important to think about form and how important form is, and how a lot of times form is the primary consideration of the artist, and the content comes out of that. So I do think that that's true, but I don't think that it always proceeds mathematically, because I think that he makes this sound like it was planned out the whole time. There were no accidents, even happy accidents. Which in the experience of a lot of people seems to be the case. So let's talk about this in the discussion, and let me know what you think about this, what you think of The Raven, and how you think that the sound contributes to the poem. And also we can bring in the Jabberwocky here. Maybe you think it's silly that I gave you that poem, but it's just to emphasize the formal considerations of a poem, and a lot of times that includes the sound, because Jabberwocky seems to be a nonsense type of poem, but I want to know what your experience of that poem is. So we don't have to explicate it and try to figure out, which is sort of what the with the little thing afterwards. I think the poem is on 734, and then there's Humpty Dumpty explicating the Jabberwocky on 735. We don't have to explicate that poem, but I want you to tell me what your feelings are about that and what your experience of the poem is. Is it total nonsense? Is it sort of an exercise? Is it a complete poem? And things like that. But I wanted to give you The Raven and this philosophy of composition because I wanted you to think more about just... I wanted you to think more than just what the poem is about. Because we all probably remember when we were in high school and the teacher standing up at the front of the class, and now it's time to figure out what the poem means, right? And there's more to a poem than what the poem means. And sometimes the meaning of the poem could come out of the formal considerations or the efforts made in shaping or crafting the actual object. So that's the reason why I gave this to you. I find it really interesting. Maybe you'll disagree with me, so you'll have to let me know in discussion.